Now, people living in the Lancashire town of Blackburn may face a phased lockdown if extra measures brought in this week do not halt the spike in coronavirus cases.
Health officials describe the increase as a rising tide centred on the South Asian community and pinned down to multi-occupancy households in areas with terraced housing.
In the week to July the 11th, Blackburn had 47 cases of the virus per 100,000 people, an increase from 31.6 cases per 100,000 the previous week.
Well, this puts Blackburn third highest behind Leicester, which has 118.2 cases per 100,000, and nearby Pendle with a rate of 76.6 cases per 100,000 people. Joining us now is Professor Dominic Harrison, who's Director of Public Health for Blackburn and Darwen, and community and inclusion activist SAIMA AFZAL. Good morning to both of you. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. So let's come to you first then, Professor Harrison. Just explain the reasons behind this. How concerned are you about how able you are to stem this rising tide as you've described it?
Well, we are very concerned, but we've been engaging with the communities involved, and they have been exemplary in the efforts they're putting in to work with us to stem this tide of rising cases. What we know is that we think one person is becoming infected and is taking that infection into a household where 4 or 5 others are being infected, and what we're seeing is clusters of those households in certain areas across the borough, and we're very confident that we can turn this around because we've got excellent engagement and support from the communities involved.
Do you think that the message has been getting through clearly enough to people about measures that they need to take in order to protect themselves and to protect family members, other people in their community?
Well, we do, but we are strengthening those messages with the community themselves, and the community themselves, mainly the South Asian community in Blackburn with Darwen, have been themselves funding, resourcing and taking action on some of those risks and the messages that need to be strengthened. We're also bringing in 5 special measures over the next 2 weeks to the 27th of July. If those don't work to change the rates, to turn the rates round, we will go into a phased, measure-by-measure reversal of the existing lockdown measures.
Yeah. Simon AFZAL, so we are talking here about the Asian communities, and I know they've been very honest about that in Blackburn. 85% of the cases are from the Asian community. I know you yourself, as a community activist and councillor in the area, have been working very, very hard on this over the last few months. What are the specific reasons, do you think? Why are we seeing this disproportionate number of Asian people infected?
Thank you and good morning. Before I actually go into answering that, I think there's a really important point when you introduce about, that we must be blunt with the figures, discuss those figures. But what I do think we need to do is have a fair analysis. Unfortunately, we've had a lot of media interest in the town, some of it positive, some of it actually a little bit problematic, where assumptions are being drawn from the data put out there. And what I want to say, the community influencers, and there's a variety of them, and I will always, Dominic will tell you, I will always be the first one to say there's gaps here, we need to do a bit more inclusion. The community influencers themselves wanted that data out there so they can legitimately then approach their communities and explain what's going on. And so in terms of the reasons, there's a cocktail of factors, and I'm not going to sit here and say I know that 100%. I'm going to comment on the feedback that I get from my women's groups in particular. And obviously I see it on social media. I am a counsellor. I get a lot of feedback from different communities. And they are generally, a lot of them do say, it's about the multi-generational household. You've got numerous people living in one home, which is not a bad thing under normal circumstances. We're taking care of our elders. But in this situation, you've got some members of the community who are younger, healthier, going out into the community and doing what they need to, coming back, earning a living, studying, coming back. And they may well be infecting those with underlying health issues without realising, because as we all are finding out about this virus, you may not display any symptoms at all. So as a council, I'm very supportive of the measures that are being put in place to try and keep people safer and stop the increase of the cases within the community.
Yeah. I mean, look, I have a lot of sympathy for the British Asian community. I think when they see, you know, unelected members of the government going on day trips to castles, they see people ploughing the beaches, and it's not necessarily a thing that lots of Asian families do en masse, going to Bournemouth and getting drunk. It's not their thing. They see the pubs open. That doesn't apply to Pakistani Muslim communities in Blackburn. They can't get any benefit from that, of going to the pub. But they look at that and they think, well, OK, we're not going to go to the pub. We're not going to travel hundreds of miles and go up a castle in Durham. We're just going to go 2 doors down and just check in on my auntie or the grandmother or the in-laws. I can understand why they don't see that as a problem. But do you think, and this is something that I was involved with, a number of other Asian celebrities very early on in the pandemic, where we tried to get messages across. For example, the very early days, there was a message that if you think you've got the symptoms, isolate in your house. Now, that is incredibly difficult if you're a multi-generational family to try and isolate in a small house if one of you've got the virus. Do you think, Dominic Harrison, that actually some of the messaging, whether it's from the government or maybe some of the lessons that you've learnt yourself, weren't perhaps so specific from the very beginning?
Hello?
Oh, have we lost Dominic there?
No.
Dominic, I don't know whether you caught me there. Do you think?
Hear now.
Yeah. Do you think some of the messaging, whether it's from the government or even some of the messaging that you put out, and maybe you've learnt some lessons in the last few months, do you think it was specific enough for some of these Asian communities? And a lot of people talk about, the language. I don't necessarily mean putting it in Urdu or Punjabi. I just think some of those cultural issues that are more relevant to, say, multi-generational families and how you would isolate in a home, for example, when there's quite a lot of you living in a small house.
No, I think that's a really good point, and certainly the lockdown lifting measures that said 2 households could meet within 1 household as long as they socially distanced, has a very disproportionate effect on South Asian families, because you know, a white nuclear family of two adults, 2 children is very different to a traditional South Asian family where 2 families or 2 households can mean a much bigger group of people. So in many cases we can see, although South Asian communities are sticking absolutely to the rules, the impact on them is very different. And I think that's partly perhaps a lesson for central government, that measures that are brought in at the national level have a differential impact on some communities. And I'd just like to pick up some of the things that SAIMA was saying as well, because one of our biggest risks in this pandemic is going to be if we create stigma or shame for being diagnosed with coronavirus, because one of the consequences of that will be that people will be increasingly reluctant either to get tested or to declare that they're a contact, and that will have a risk for us all. And I want to say it's worth remembering that in the first phase of this pandemic, it was white, wealthy, travellers, mainly older retired people, that were infected on out-of-season holidays in Spain, France and Italy, and brought that infection back and seeded it within multiple communities across the UK. We're now seeing, and of course what they did also, unfortunately, we saw in that case, they were the first case, the index case, and the next 4 people infected in their case was often their close family, because it is very difficult to avoid infecting a household if one person is infected, particularly if they're infected asymptomatically, as SAIMA was saying.
Simon, can I just want, because we're running out of time, so I just wanted to sort of, talk about a bit more about that messaging, because, of course, we had this report, didn't we? We know that black and minority ethnic populations are more at risk of catching this, and it's going to be more serious when they do catch it. Were you surprised we didn't see any recommendations? We didn't have that sort of specific advice to say, these are the steps that you need to take in order to protect yourself? Or do you think that the government were worried in a sense of differentiating between populations and saying, well, it's OK for you to do this, but, if you're South Asian, you shouldn't be doing this? Oh, sorry, that's to SAIMA.
All right, sorry.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sorry. In terms of differentiation, I think that you've got to contextualise it. If somebody's saying, if you're a young person and you're at one aspect of risk, or if you're an older person, you've got a certain element of risk, I think it's important that we do our equality impact assessments. I know they're not legally defined, but we've got to do them. And the government and I appreciate some of it had to be done quite hurriedly and quite quickly, but there are, with the Black Lives Matter movement, people are calling out for those inequalities that are in the systems and in the infrastructure. And again, we've seen that again in the infrastructure. We've got a generic message that's not excluded just Asian communities, but those with disabilities, LGBT, you know, travellers. There's a whole range of communities that needed to be factored in. And so some of that I do feel should have been given to the local authorities or the local communities and more engagement. I know you can't do it straight away. Certainly, we've had a long time now. We've been in a lockdown in a long time now. We've had plenty of time to do that engagement and the government to pick that up really on our behalf, rather than us having to shout for it and shout very loud. And as women, I mean, I deal with domestic abuse, those women in isolation, and there's so many other elements that I would love to talk about today, but I can't, because the main message is about, you know, following the 5 regulations and guidelines that we put in place.
Well, SAIMA, maybe we'll get you back on again. I think we ought to, and your voice needs to be heard. Thanks for joining us, SAIMA AFZAL, MBE's local inclusion activist and counsellor in the area. And thank you, Professor Dominic Harrison, Director of Public Health and Wellbeing at Blackburn and Darwen Borough Council. I mean,